Lietuvā apskatot laika posmu no 44. līdz 53. gadam, par to mums referēs Ramona Staveckaitė-Notari no Lietuvas Genocīda un pretošanās pētījumu centra un ir Vēstures pētījumu programmas vadītāja.
Today I would like to present my speech I will talk about the armed anti-Soviet resistance in Lithuania in 1944 and 1953. And during my presentation, I prepared some slideshows, so you can, some iconographic material, so you can imagine, and you will see a lot of similarities with a colleague from Poland that he showed in his presentation, so we can understand that our history, our experience, Soviet repressions, where they used the same methods. So 2018 and 2019 are very important for Lithuania because the remains of Adolfas Ramonauskas-Vanagas, the chief commander of the Lithuanian partisan armed forces, have been found by the archaeologists at the orphan cemetery in Vilnius. Ramonauskas-Vanagas was detained in 1956 and was brutally tortured by the Soviet and at the end executed a year later. And the remains of Antanas Kraujelis Siaubūnas, Lithuanian last Postwar partisan who was killed in 1965 with a gun in his hands, have been discovered in the same orphan cemetery in Vilnius in June. So it's, these events are very recent. And of course, in 2019 we are celebrating 70 years since the signature on 16th of February 1949. The declaration of the Council of the Lithuanian Freedom Fight Movement was signed. So those last 2 years for Lithuanian history, especially post-war history, are very important and a lot of new discoveries to be made still. And after the first occupation in the summer of 1940, Lithuanian society was kind of in a shock. President Antanas Smetona escaped from the country. Commanders of the army didn't dare to resist to the occupational Red Army. After the second Soviet occupation in the summer of 1944, Lithuania was, we can say, after all events, physically and morally destroyed. And it could sound paradoxical, but Lithuania kind of needed the partisan war to restore its self-respect, national self-respect. And the armed anti-Soviet resistance was a hope and an aspiration for a free Lithuania future, even if the country suffered huge human losses and brutal Soviet repressions. Oh, what I did? Sorry, just, okay. The Lithuanian anti-Soviet armed resistance of 44-53 was one of the biggest and longest guerrillas war in Europe in all the 20th century. The partisan war for democratic and independent Lithuania began during the summer of 1944. And when the Second World War was still being fought, and Lithuania had their highest hopes set on the future peace conferences. Unfortunately, as we know, the issue of the Baltic countries was never discussed at the conferences of the Allies during the war. The partisan war remained unknown in the West during all 50 years of Lithuanian occupation. This situation was caused, as we know, by the Iron Curtain, and the communist regime always tried to deny the fact that the Baltic states were occupied. The Soviet leaders, they sought factual and legal recognition from foreign countries regarding the seizure of those states and their annexation to the USSR. The occupant authorities called the partisan, as we were talking here already here, partisan bandits. The freedom fighters units in the documents were referred as a gangs. Meanwhile, in the recently declassified CIA reports, the Lithuanian partisans are called army or guerrillas. In July 1944, the Soviet army marched into Lithuania. The second occupation began. So resistance actions against the Soviet occupation began from the very first step of Red Army in Lithuania and continued to the spring until 1953. When the Soviet arrested LLKS Council Presidium Chairman Jonas Žemaitis-Vytautas. And the strategic goal of the Lithuanian partisan was to reestablish an independent, democratic Lithuanian state. And in 1944, when the Soviet Union occupied Lithuania for a second time, tens of thousands of Lithuanians joined the struggle against the occupation forces, and in 45, about already 30,000 armed men joined the forces in the forests. Some of them joined the partisans to avoid serving in the occupational army, the others to avoid the possible repressions or deportation. However, majority of who chose armed struggle, they chose consciously and were committed to fight until the restoration of an independent Lithuanian state. And it was always emphasized by partisans themselves that it is a magnificent fight for the liberation of the nation. The resistance partisans, they didn't believe that they could defeat the Soviet occupation forces by themselves. At best, partisans tried very hard to make life difficult for the Soviet occupiers. They disrupted Soviet organized farce elections by attacking polling stations and destroying ballots. During the first year of guerrilla war, partisans would take provincial towns and by storm and hold them several days to demonstrate the existence of the Lithuanian power which could resist the occupational force. Partisans only wanted to delay and harass the Soviets, waiting for the Western support. But sadly, the expectations were dashed, and for 9 years, Lithuania fought completely alone. In 1944, there could be about up to 30,000 partisans in Lithuania forest, led by the former officers, students, teachers, farmers. During the first 2 years of armed resistance, from 44 to 45, about 10,000 partisans were killed. You can imagine that it's almost about half of all victims of entire partisan war just during 2 years. And historians usually identify 5 factors which conditioned and provoked armed resistance in Lithuania. That could be experience of the previous Soviet and German occupations, mobilization to Red Army and Soviet terror during the post-war years, and the resistance movement during Nazi occupation, which encouraged a lot of people, young men, to fight against the communist regime as well. Another reason is hope for Western support, and the last one, of course, we can't exclude it, it's patriotism. In the first stage of war, that was 44-46, the struggle was quite spontaneous, and however, little by little, a structure based on military formation was formed all over Lithuania. During this period, the largest battles took place, and in 44-45, large partisan units were from like up to 200 men. They were quite well armed with machine guns and other armament, and they could attack small towns, destroy offices of occupational forest authorities, disarm the military units of local collaborators, and destroy mobilization documents. But it was also very important, trying to avoid mobilization to Red Army. The first stage essentially resulted in the establishment of resistance organization in the fall of 1946, and it was organized in 7 districts. During these years, the partisans suffered, unfortunately, huge losses. Already in 44, 45, as I mentioned, more than 10,000 partisans were killed. So the losses forced, the huge losses forced the partisans to change their tactics. And during the second stage, it was May 46, November 48, partisans avoided open fights with much larger and combative forces. They divided themselves into smaller groups. They operated into groups of 7 to 20 partisans. And at this time, there were only 4,000 partisans during this period. The activity became more conspiratorial. They started to build underground bunkers. The communication system was improved, and namely in this period, the publication of a partisan press flourished. It's quite a unique phenomenon occurring during this armed resistance, because we had, Lithuanian partisans had over 80 periodicals where they were issued during this partisan war. The MGB tactics changed radically together with the changes of partisan tactics. The mass military actions were replaced by more delicate methods of fighting, and the growing network of agents gave the possibility to infiltrate them into the environment of the partisans and destroy them from inside. Military operations were organized according to the specific data which was collected by the agents regarding the location, the scale, and the armament of the partisan units. Freedom fighters during this period still had hopes about the West intervention during this period. They wanted informal world about the guerrilla war was going on in Lithuania and expected to receive weapons, armaments, medicine, communication facilities, and political support from Western countries. And finally, the relations with the West were established. Exactly in the spring of 1947, the representatives Juozas Lukša and Jurgis Kriščiūnas managed to break through the Iron Curtain. Through Poland and Sweden, Germany, they reached through Poland, Sweden, and then we reached Germany, where a big diaspora of Lithuanian active people was created. And in the spring, later in the 1950 and in 1951, Lithuanian paratroopers were instructed by the American intelligence school in Germany and landed in Lithuania. Their object was to collect information regarding the number of soldiers in Lithuania, the distribution of its military garrisons. Unfortunately, they were soon traced. Some of them were arrested and recruited by the Soviet secret services, and others were killed after the treasons of their counterparts. The first stage is November 48, May 53. The third stage, the last stage, was the most difficult stage. The partisan armed resistance lost its strength, and only about 2,000 fighters remained in active fight. The Soviet organized a brutal liquidation of armed households, mass deportation of farmers to Siberia were carried out in 1948 and 1949. The forest brothers were deprived from their main supporters. However, during this stage, the joint authority of military and political resistance was created. During this period, the greatest attention was given to propaganda work, information war, or unconventional war, as we use in the terminology today. The partisans issued underground newspapers, books, and proclamations. The military territorial resistance structure was created prior to the meeting of the partisan leaders in February 1949. This structure remained unchanged until the end of guerrilla war. And at the beginning of 1949, 9 districts were united into 3 regions: Southern, Western, and Eastern. In 1949, despite the weakening of the partisan resistance, the partisans managed to unite Lithuanian patriotic forces into one organization and formed a joint military and political leadership of the resistance. During the meeting of all Lithuanian partisan commanders in February 1949, its 8 leaders, so-called signatories, the movement for the struggle for freedom of Lithuania was established, and military and political documents were adopted. On 16th of February 1949, Movement for the Struggle for Freedom of Lithuania issued a political declaration that our ambassador already mentioned it, but it's very important for all the movement and history of partisan war. A declaration which proclaimed that the supreme legitimate authority in Lithuania was the partisan leadership, and the aim of their fight was to restore an independent democratic republic of Lithuania. This declaration today constitutes a legal act of the state of Lithuania, and Captain Jonas Žemaitis-Vytautas of the Lithuanian army was elected chairman of the presidium of this council, and Adolfas Ramanauskas Vanagas was appointed as the chief commander of the partisan armed forces. The Lithuanian partisan acted as a military structure. They took over the traditions of the Lithuanian armed forces and continued them. The heads of larger units established provisional regulations and rules regulating partisan activities according to the rules of the independent Lithuanian army. The fighters had to unconditionally maintain military discipline and conform to the established ethical norms. Joining the ranks of partisans, they had to take the oath. And in the case of grave crime, they were tried by the martial court. So we see that it was completely military structure. And military uniforms and appropriate recognition badges also served as disciplinary measures. Very soon fictitious partisan headquarters were set up as well during this period. MGB captured alive and then recruited partisans, and especially partisans commanders, to destroy partisan movement from inside. The measures completely disorganized the partisan communication system, chain of treason started, and all those factors provoked that partisans eventually were morally and physically broken. For example, in 47, already in 47, 64% of the partisans were killed after being betrayed. Later, almost all the partisans were killed after betrayals. Farmers formed the majority of the partisans, and very few members of the resistance were professional soldiers. Another very significant group in partisan of people in partisan war was we call so supporters. The partisans were supplied with food, clothing, and shelter by a 4x larger network of legally residing assistants and supporters. And the contacts with the other partisans units were maintained with the help of, as we so-called, signal women, because mostly women were kept the connections among the partisan units. During the partisan war, the Soviet repressive structures focused not only on how to eliminate partisans, but their supporters as well. Therefore, soon after 45 deportations of the partisans' family members and supporters started. Totally around 84,000 people in 49 were deported. And deportation destroyed the social basis of the countryside. Partisans found more and more difficult to get food, footwear, and other basic necessities to survive. The struggle against anti-Soviet resistance in Lithuania was headed by the NKVD and KGB. In spring of 46, they were named by MVD and MGB. The main task of the Soviet repressive structures was to crush the partisan resistance. The number of units of repressive structures and Red Army forces in Lithuania peaked in the summer of 1945, when it was high as 25,000 and were approximately 14,000 in 46 and about 10,000 in 51. Another paramilitary group that was formed by the Soviet occupation structures to fight the partisan was the armed collaborators known as Stribai. We called Stribki, it's from a Russian word istrebiteli. And they were mainly formed from local people and were assigned to do many so-called dirty jobs. One of the worst was the mutilation of the partisan bodies in town squares and involvement into deportations. In May 1953, after the treason, Jonas Žemaitis Vytautas, the partisan commander for all of Lithuania and chairman of the presidium of the movement council, was arrested. In the final statement in the court, Žemaitis said, I still believe that the struggle I have led for 9 years will bring its result. He was executed in Moscow in Butyrki prison on November 26, 1954. This is, I just will interrupt myself, from punitive files we found a lot of caricatures about, so we can understand that partisans were quite creative people as well. In autumn 1956 was arrested the last partisan leader, Adolfas Ramanauskas. He was executed after ferocious tortures on November 29, 1957. The decade-long post-Second World War armed resistance that took place in Lithuania is a unique, exceptional phenomenon in the history of Lithuania. Over 50,000 people were engaged in guerrilla war. More than 20,000 partisans lost their lives. About 2,000 were arrested. As a consequence, 140,000 persons were imprisoned and about 118 were deported to Siberia. Was it worth fighting an unequal war against the Soviet Union? Definitely yes, stated partisan and poet Bronius Krivickas on the eve of his death. He wrote, on one hand, it increased the losses of the nation because it required many casualties. On the other hand, it decreased the losses because enemy felt a strong reaction to his deadly grip and was forced to take that reaction seriously. The planned national annihilation was reduced and delayed, wrote Krivickas. So that's would be the end of my speech, and I will comment just my colleague. We have seen something completely similar things, but I just wanted to say that the reason why they exposed those bodies of killed partisans, especially in small towns in the market square, you can see a local people. So it was like this, the Soviet occupational, especially Stribki, they looked at the reaction of the people and they could recognize it. They were his child, mother, sister, so they knew that it's their relatives, and of course it was not immediately, but already put in the blacklist for deportation, for arrest, and so on. And usually we see most of the partisans without shoes, because it was for the Soviet repressive structures quite a big lack of the shoes for practical. We used to take off the shoes from killed partisans. And I will finish my, this is a military operation in Lithuania. We always see, we can see the difference in the faces, even in physiology, the expressions and so on. And this is the original declaration of this Council Freedom Fight that was signed on February 16th. The main document and of all partisan resistance. And this is the main commanders. It's called Vito de Žemaitis, as he was, and after his arrest in a prison, it's from their punitive files, and this is Vanagas, and his photo after his arrest. Yeah, so that's it.
Tātad laiks arī jautājumiem ir iespēja uzdot par referātiem. So maybe I will start. In this conference, we are looking to armed resistance as a common phenomenon in this region, and we know some cases when, for example, Latvian and Lithuanian partisans fought together. Maybe you can describe a little bit more about contacts between Lithuanian and other partisans.
Yes, especially on the border of Lithuania with Latvia. The Lithuanians and Latvian partisans had quite intensive contacts, and as I know, or I like research one case when one partisan, he is from town of Rokiškis, that's very close to the border of Latvia. He was he escaped in Latvia and changed his identity, lived in Riga, and later, even though somehow with the KGB KGB repressive structures managed to identify that he was him, and they brought him back to Lithuania. Also, I know the cases when I don't remember the town, how it's called, Narves. It's very close also to the border of Lithuania, near Biržai, that also few partisans were hiding at the support of Latvian partisan supporter women. And they were tried by Latvian, of course, the woman was tried by the Latvian for repressive structures, and the Lithuanians by the Lithuanians. So we can see quite a lot of movement, because I think it was natural to cross the border, and very often Lithuanian partisans units, they cross the border to hide themselves in the forest of Latvia.
Vēl ir jautājumi?
My question is as follows. Is there any significant was there cooperation between Lithuanian and Polish partisans against the Soviet regime? Thanks.
Well, I would say that the district of Lithuania was in the district of Vilnius. Majority was Armia Krajova fighting, and as far as we know, with Lithuanian partisans and Armia Krajova, they didn't have connections, and quite often I think we were quite hostile to each other sometimes, even though we have to admit, and from both parts, either Lithuanian, either Polish. So they didn't keep relations and connections. On contrary.